I look eccentric.
Hi, my name is Elias Martinez, and welcome to South Asia Deconstructed, a speaker series hosted by the Indigo Collective. Before we start, this speaker series is in no way representative of the university. It's not officially sponsored. Anything said here today is either that of a student organization or our speakers, and does not officially represent the university in any way. Make sure that your phones are on silent. If for whatever reason you need to leave, please do so on the doors to your right. Also, to thank our sponsors, we'd like to thank the College of Liberal Arts, the Center for Asian American Studies, the South Asia Institute, LGBTQ Studies, the Department of History, the Liberal Arts Honors Program, the Plan 2 Honors Program from the Moody College of Communications. I'd like to thank the Center for Entertainment and Media Industries, Communication Studies from Texas Mukund School of Business. I'd like to thank the Harkley Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies, and lastly, the UT Student Coalition for Caste Abolition. And with all that being said, please welcome Shri, our guest speaker.
Thank you so much for that intro. Howdy, Austin. My name is Shri. I'm a Desi trans producer, DJ, and artist. And today I have the honor to speak before you at the University of Texas. And much like myself, you may be wondering, what do I have to say that's so important? When Amu first reached out about this opportunity, I was exhilarated, yet I felt a deep sense of imposter syndrome. Sure, I've had a unique life experience and I have much on my mind that I want to share, but most of all, what I was feeling was a need to connect my story to the issues we see in the world today, especially in a time like this politically. As I was thinking of a theme for this speech, an idea came to mind: the butterfly effect. By definition, the butterfly effect is a phenomenon where a minute localized change in a complex system can have large effects elsewhere. I've loved this idea since I was a little kid because it inherently means everything is connected. And I hope today I can make the most of this platform and show you all how my story and your story are interconnected and how these connections can better help us understand one another and bring us together. My story begins with my parents. They were immigrants who came to the US through a work visa, and we hear this type of story often in the South Asian diaspora. A lot of our families immigrated for work and better economic opportunities, and growing up as a first-generation kid, my parents told me this was because Indians are well-educated and needed in the US to perform intellectual tasks. It took me years to deconstruct that model minority myth that was deeply ingrained in my family's thinking to take a deeper look at what was actually going on. For one, the level of education my parents had access to was directly tied to their caste privilege in India. Many caste-oppressed families never had the opportunity to even consider immigrating to the US, and additionally, my family comes from an Indian Tamil background, which differs greatly from the Sri Lankan Tamil experience, particularly in how the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora was shaped by genocide. My family immigrated for better economic opportunities, while many Sri Lankan Tamil families were forced to flee their homeland for survival. I was not taught these things growing up at all. In fact, my family took pride in their caste status and carried that same mentality into the US. I'd grown up in a bubble surrounded by caste-privileged families who had normalized this type of behavior and in turn normalized colorism and racism. As I questioned my parents about these things, they always seemed to get defensive and make excuses. So instead, I distanced myself from religion and the traditions that my family held so dear, and then a realization hit me. We were sort of the white people of India. Of course, there's nuance to this conversation because I also knew from my childhood that we sure as hell weren't the white people of America. I grew up in a small suburban town where the racism I experienced was comparable to the worst Instagram comment section you've ever seen come to life. And it was completely normalized. It wasn't until college that this even started to subside a bit, and during that period of my life, the attacks often came from white or Indian folk themselves. So it was especially surprising to me at the time how my parents always aligned themselves with whiteness when given the option. They preferred that I had white, Indian, or Asian friends growing up compared to Black or Latinx friends. But my lived experience told me something different. Black and brown communities were always the ones that made me feel safest and most welcome. The contradictions between my family's belief and my real-world experience forced me to confront just how ingrained colorism and racism are in our diaspora and its connections to the caste system. All these reflections ended up hitting me quite late in life because from ages 9 to 17, I was preoccupied struggling with 5 relapses of lymphoma, which is a type of cancer, for those who do not know. At age 9, I discovered a large lump on my neck, so my dad took me to the doctor's office, and the next thing I knew, I was diagnosed with stage 4B cancer, which is pretty much one of the last stages, so I'm glad they found it when they did. The doctors at Yale did not think I'd make it, but here I am today proving them wrong. The first time I got it, I was in 5th grade. I underwent chemo and radiation, and I was in and out of school. I had the whole bald head and everything, and other 5th graders didn't really understand what was going on, and it almost felt like they were jealous that I got to miss school without seeing the pain that I was going through. So I can remember that during this time, it was one of the first times that I turned to music to help take me away from my everyday reality and bring me to a place of hope. The treatment plan they had seemed to work at first. It was a lot of chemo and radiation, and I was in remission for all of 6th grade, and then it hit me again at the start of 7th grade. And every time cancer comes back, it gets harder to treat. So this time I needed to undergo a stem cell transplant, and this meant months in the hospital, and basically is a method of killing off everything in your body with chemo in hopes that you can start anew. This ended up not working for me either, so I needed to get an even stronger version of it at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore during my 8th grade. This was very tough for my family since we all left Connecticut, where I grew up, and we had to go to Baltimore for the entire year. That stem cell transplant was one of the most difficult things I've ever had to go through, and the recovery process is really like starting over again. I even needed to relearn how to walk in that period of time. Needless to say, I did not attend any of 7th or 8th grade and had home tutors come so I wouldn't fall behind instead. This treatment also seemed to work for me for a bit, and I got to go to 9th and 10th grade full time before it came back once again for me. This time, they needed to try a completely different approach with immunotherapy. Immunotherapy is a form of treatment that helps target and boost your own immune system to be able to fight cancer. This had significantly less side effects for me, and I was even able to keep my hair. Things seemed to be looking up, and I went on through 11th grade, and midway through 12th, it hit me once again. This time, they tried a combo of immunotherapy and chemotherapy, and I did lose my hair again, but this time people had at least matured enough to understand what I was going through. And it feels like a blessing to now be able to say I've been in remission for 7 years now. In a lot of ways, it felt like my life was on hold during that time. I had moments where I questioned my gender and can even think back to memories as early as 1st grade where I can go, yeah, that was probably because you were trans. But I didn't dare risk adding another layer of complexity to my life as I was already just trying to survive during that time. My mindset today is deeply shaped as my experience as a cancer survivor, and it taught me to be grateful for the little things and the big things. And it gave me an innate understanding of the fragility of our human lives that I take with me through everyday life. I am very grateful that I was able to be treated at some of the best hospitals in the world, and my family had the right insurance to cover my treatment and were able to be there to support me through the whole journey. Although like many others in the US, we still struggled financially due to the broken healthcare system we have here, we eventually made it through. While I was being treated, I never thought of the toll it took on my family as well. My sister had to move around several schools as I got treated at different hospitals, and my grandma left her life in India to come care for me for several years. It had a huge emotional impact on my mom and dad as well. While I was just a kid and didn't always understand the depth of the situation or what was happening, they had to live in this constant fear that their kid might pass away before they did and make the right medical decisions for me to ensure that didn't happen. I feel grateful to even be alive today because I met so many others along that journey who didn't make it, and I live for them, as cliche as it sounds, like each day is my last. As I reflect, I can't help but think how my privilege played a role in even allowing me to survive. But why does that matter? Because these patterns of privilege don't just disappear, they evolve. The rise of conservatism in both the US and India shows us that white supremacy and caste supremacy are deeply interconnected. In the US, we are governed by a white supremacist system, but if that's the case, why are so many caste-privileged Indians in positions of power within the current administration? The answer lies in caste. Caste-privileged Indians often align themselves with whiteness, taking part in the same caste-based discrimination they were raised with. Today, as I stand before you, I don't want to just share my personal experience, I want to make the connections of these systems of oppression visible. Today, as we actively fight for trans rights in states like Texas that are targeting us any way they can, it's important to take a look at how this fight is connected to other struggles. Looking back at my own experience, I was deeply aware of what society thought of trans women growing up. And for that reason, even though I knew I was trans at an early age, I did everything I could to be utterly sure before I transitioned. In a way, I was crossing off a checklist of things that I needed to do before I could admit to myself I was truly the trans woman I knew I was in my heart. I like to think of this checklist as a defense mechanism. In my mind, I needed to try being a straight man, a gay man, non-binary, before I could admit to myself who I truly was. And this checklist was really just a byproduct of trans misogyny. Sadly, in our world, trans women get the blunt end of it, as we can see today in the federal and state legislature, which largely targets trans women. I was scared of what it meant to be feminine in a world that hates femininity. I had felt the greatest moments of gender euphoria when I searched up how to turn a t-shirt into a dress, or tried on makeup for the first time, or other stereotypically feminine things, and I did feel a strong sense of gender dysphoria towards the opposite as well. But it was difficult for me to contend with the contradictions between what society was telling me and how I felt. Regardless, I ended up fully coming out my senior year of college, and I can credit this entirely to my women's and gender studies classes I took during this time. These classes provided me with a space that truly validated and educated me on my identity and how I was feeling, and helped me with my unlearning process. For several years prior, I was engaging in self-destructive tendencies from being in the closet and numbing my emotions instead of feeling. For me, the coming out process ended up being one of the most isolating times of my life, but it was vital for me to continue on with my life. Throughout this time, music was always there for me and helped me feel as though I was never truly alone. It took my parents almost 2 years to get on board with me being trans, stop misgendering me, and not think it was just a phase. And our relationship was strained during this time since the communities they were part of were caste privileged and inherently anti-queer. It was hard for them to grapple with the societal impacts of my transition. It felt as though a lot of people I knew before I was out didn't stick around like I thought they would, which left me rebuilding my community from scratch. At a time, I was based out of Connecticut, and there's only so much you can do in suburbia to create new connections. So I ended up turning to social media to create the queer community I knew I needed. And that was a pivotal moment for me because I realized how many like-minded people there were out there, but I also learned how deeply hatred runs. Some of my content ended up going viral and getting millions of views, but was filled with anti-trans hate and death threats in the comment section. This definitely took a toll on my mental health, but I leaned on the voices that supported me during this time. Once I moved to New York, it felt as though the community I had created online came to real life, and what I was searching for had finally been found. I would never want anyone else coming out to ever have an isolating experience similar to mine. However, as the federal government aims for trans rights, it only makes it more common of an experience. I'm a trans woman speaking in Texas, one of the most openly hostile states for trans people in the US. However, the attacks on our rights are escalating at an alarming rate, and now is not the time to fall silent. Yet, it seems as though our communities are as divided as ever, because we don't take into account the interconnectedness of our struggles. We fail to realize how transphobia, casteism, racism, and misogyny are all connected. The US was built on violence, slavery, and oppression, and because it was built this way, it continues to repeat these patterns globally, whether that be through supporting fascism in India or funding genocide in Palestine. India was built off caste violence and oppression, and it also recreates these patterns in Kashmir and through Hindutva. These patterns don't just happen randomly, they happen because systems of power thrive off division. In the late-stage capitalistic society we live in, a select few hoard the wealth and power and continue to do everything they can to keep us divided. Regardless, For me, music has always been an outlet and a way to bring people together. I started playing piano in first grade, and when I was going through treatment and had a weakened immune system, my teacher came home to give me lessons. I moved on to playing the guitar in sixth grade, entirely self taught and inspired by Green Day, actually. And I remember vividly how much the vibrations of the guitar itself helped to soothe my pain during this treatment. I truly felt the healing power of music during this time and knew this was something I was meant to do. As I entered high school, I started learning the trumpet so I could join my high school's marching band. Playing the trumpet felt like a bold reclamation to me. The doctors always told me I would never have full lung capacity again, and doing something like playing the trumpet and running around on a field would not be possible for someone like me. I proved them wrong once again, and our band went on to be #1 on the East Coast that year. I eventually transitioned to playing the drums, and that is when I truly fell in love with an instrument. It felt as though I was searching for the right musical voice to express myself, and with all that I had gone through and was still suppressing at the time, the drums really spoke to me and I devoted a lot of my time and energy into it. I eventually auditioned and got a spot on bass drum with my school's marching band my senior year. This was coincidentally when I also had my final relapse, and since I had worked so hard to get this spot on bass, I was not going to let anything take that away from me. For too long in my life, I had put everything on hold during cancer treatment, but this time I was continue to go on with my life regardless. During that time, I was in treatment, school, marching band, and worked a part-time job. Our band even ended up getting selected to march in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and I remember telling myself to this day, if I could march for 2 miles with a 50-pound bass drum while I was recovering from treatment, there was nothing I could not do, and I bring that mindset with me today. In college, I did not have access to any instruments, so instead I started producing on my computer with Logic. I did this for many years, producing for various CT rappers, all of whom happened to be men. As hard as I tried, I could not find any women or non-binary rappers or producers to work with in CT. Not saying that they did not exist, just that it's hard to find those connections and communities in suburbia in a place like Connecticut that's so divided and so individualistic. But regardless, I eventually started honing in on my own vocals and tracks and producing for myself. As I did this, I also started working with artists in New York and finally got to diversify the type of artists I worked with. Whether it was producing for a friend or sending out a beat pack on a whim, I ended up slowly getting placements and now have over 1 million streams on my productions on Spotify alone. This was a lesson to myself to always shoot my shot. I got rejected or ghosted so many times, but the few wins I got was all I needed. I realized next that DJing was a way to bring the entirety of my craft to life and create my own community spaces that I needed so much when I was growing up. I could spin songs that showcased my music taste along with my own productions. After I figured that out, I started playing live shows throughout CT in New York, hosting a few events of my own, including an all-trans femme lineup. I know that I could have used an event like that growing up, and it was a very healing experience for my inner child. As I started sharing my music on social media, I realized that it was bringing trans South Asian people together over my art and inspiring others in their trans journeys. The most touching moment that I distinctly recall was when I got a message from a mother of a Desi trans daughter that said her daughter wanted to be just like me when she grows up, and that's when a fire was lit for me. I realized the power of what I was doing in inspiring others with my music and helping the future generation have positive representation they can look toward. For me, music and community have always been interlinked and are a force to bring people together. As I hope I have been able to highlight today, a small negative action can have large consequences elsewhere, just as a small positive action can have large benefits elsewhere. And the first positive flap of wings, like the butterfly effect we can do, is educate. We cannot effectively fight for trans rights in the US without also fighting for abortion rights. We cannot dismantle transphobia without also dismantling caste and racism. And as long as we live under a colonial capitalistic society where white men are the ruling class, none of these fights will be easy. They will continue to use identity politics as a way to divide us while ignoring the class divide and oligarchy we live under now. Now, I know all this may sound like a lecture from your one woke friend that always kills the vibe, And I don't claim to have all the answers, but I know what we can take away is that we must build power together. For me, that means using my music to educate, inspire, and mobilize. It means breaking down barriers so the next generation has not just a handful, but an army of trans people ready to fight for our rights. And it also means embracing unapologetic trans joy, because sometimes simply existing, thriving, and celebrating ourselves is the greatest act of resistance. So I leave you with this: find your way to make a difference, educate yourself, challenge the systems around you, and above all, don't let them take your light. Huge shout out to Indigo Collective for putting on such an incredible speaker series, and come out to see me DJ tonight at the Indigo Night Market and tomorrow. Thank you.
We'll be taking questions from the crowd if anyone has any.
Yes. Of course. So that was my community in Connecticut versus New York, right? Um, so I would say it was a very, very big difference. I grew up in a very small suburban town in Connecticut that was largely white people. And I then went on to UConn, that was like a bit better of a place. But even then, there was no such trans community, no such, especially not intersections of South Asian and trans communities, especially not the intersection of that. Plus, they made music that, and I'm starting to find people and places and communities like that in New York that exist and thrive in New York. And large events that I went to, one last week that was like over 100 trans people in one event in New York. And I think things like that simply just do not exist in Connecticut yet. But I think what I do want to do is continue to like host and throw shows in Connecticut that center trans people, so that hopefully spaces and places like that continue to grow in Connecticut and places where it doesn't exist currently. Yes. Yeah, I would definitely say it's a series of moments, like you said. Because growing up, like I definitely had the inspirations in first grade, fifth grade, and stuff like that. But I never thought it was like what I wanted to do with my life until probably quite later. I always knew I wanted to be a part of my life, but I think around college when I started producing was when I realized like this is actually what I want to spend all my time doing. Um, and then I think even producing, and then once I started really DJing and like bringing those my productions and spaces to life is when I realized how impactful it can truly be in like creating communities. And I think that's when I realized also like a sustainable way to like do music like for a good chunk of my life. So um, yeah, I think it was a series of events like you said. Yes. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I would say so my identity being trans, I think comes into my music sort of just in my music taste and sort of a bit of like the hyper pop type of sound that was pioneered by trans women that like I take with me and take in with me as an inspiration in my sound. And then with my South Asian identity as well, I try to use like Carnatic vocals and other like melodies as well, and try to like blend those two together in like a new way to create something new. And off the top of my head, I've made a song called Goddess Complex that really does those two things, like bridges those two things together. So I guess that's one I can really think of, but I do want to create more tracks that really bring those two sounds together. So yeah, yes. So was the question sort of politically like fighting fire with fire, sort of? Yeah, I think that's an interesting line to balance. Obviously, we see a lot of very aggressive attacks to trans rights currently by the government, and I think there's different ways to go about fighting that. I definitely think fire with fire can be one option. I also think there's different ways depending on like what works for you. So I would just say whatever works for you best as an act of resistance, I guess. Yes. Yeah, I love that question. I think so. I think I've DJing has sort of given me an opportunity to sort of start to be a part of those communities that maybe don't even really know I'm trans, but I'm DJing for this South Asian community event, you know, and I think that's sort of the first step, as in what you said, like educate them when they're not looking. Like I feel like being representation and getting into these different spaces where, you know, they might have never seen a trans DJ before. I think DJing sort of gives me that ability since I don't only have to play my own music, but I can blend that into other popular songs people like. So it really helps to sort of um, just, you know, educate people without uh, maybe them even really knowing what's going on.
You have any questions?
Oh, I think Rima has a question.
Oh,
I had a question.
so what was that again? Okay. Yeah, so right now have been focused heavily on like playing more live shows, and I have a lot lined up throughout this spring. So I'm very much focusing on that, focusing on further honing my craft as a DJ currently. And then I think later in the year, I am planning to drop an EP of sorts that is sort of the theme I have for it at the moment is sort of just hope, entertaining hope through dark periods of time, which I think is very relevant in our current, yeah.
This might be a sort of poorly worded question, but you mentioned hyperpop as something that was started by trans women, right? I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that and how that kind of like breaks away from maybe Western musical tradition. Like what sorts of differences make like I guess trans or queer music? Like what are some I guess like I don't know, like what kind of techniques especially have been like pioneered?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one trans producer that comes to mind is Sophie, that I'm sure a lot of people know of. And there's a lot of things that she pioneered. One was like the way that she went about sound design, especially like creating the sounds in her production, as well as the whole element of hyperpop almost being like an over exaggerated version of pop that almost is a reflection on pop itself. So I think those like ideologies sort of like the over exaggeratedness of hyperpop in a way that actually causes you to reflect back on pop. I like the idea of that, and I want to bring that into my own music. Um, yeah, as well as some of those sound design elements. So yeah, yes.
How should know such a nuanced understanding of how casteism, misogyny, and white supremacy intersect? And I mean, also about, I'd like to ask about what the linguistic experience of making music has been as a Tamil speaking person.
Yeah, so I think that nuance of understanding was something that is more recent to me almost because, like, as I was sort of mentioning, I was definitely not educated on these things growing up. But I think, especially taking a look at our current government administration, I think it really is a very brings it to light how connected casteism and like white supremacy are because a lot of people are wondering like why Trump has so many Indian people in his government, and I think that is the answer. And then the same with fighting for trans rights and abortion rights, they're coming after both of those because the issues are interlinked. And then to your other question about being Tamil, I've recently got to DJ for some like Tamil events, which has really like re-inspired my want to incorporate more Tamil music into what I make and stuff. I think growing up, so I understand Tamil fluently, but I cannot speak it very well. So I want to try to get better at speaking it so I can include it in my music more. But for now, I'm just focusing on like DJing different Tamil songs. But yeah, I guess that's the inspiration there.
Oh, and I would also like to ask tonight, is there any song you're really excited to play?
Yeah, so tonight and then tomorrow as well, I have three tracks that I made specifically like for this weekend. One is like blends elements of like the hyperpop I was saying with like some vocals I did, and then also sort of just some lyrics of a different song I blended in that like very much reflect on the times we're currently in. So I'm very excited to play that one. Yeah, yes. Yeah, so obviously everyone has their own path, I would say. But for me, definitely social media did feel like a bit of a equalizer, at least. Maybe not so much at the moment, since those are a bit skewed by government at the moment. But before that happened, I would say that it was more of an equalizer and almost gave underrepresented voices like a way to showcase their music and actually be heard when in-person spaces, for me at least, were much less accessible during that time. Because yeah, I didn't have any in-person spaces to really share my music that I was working on when I first started. So social media definitely helped me get my start that way. So yeah.
Okay, I think that's all of the questions then. Thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you, Shri, for speaking about your experience. I think the way you see music as something that's self-reflexive almost, and makes us like actively question our role in the world is very inspiring. And this is part of our speaker series. We'll be having several more for the next, I think, 6 weeks at this location at this time. So if you're interested in hearing from more South Asian speakers, please do attend. And we also have a fundraising link if you are able to support us. I think we're a unique org at UT, and that we want to be critical about institutions and the creation of power, and also our own complicity in that. So thank you again for coming today, everyone.
Thank you all so much.